My name is Gabi Ngobo. I am the curatorial director at the Javed Art Center at the University of Pretoria, shortly known as the Javed UP. It is my pleasure for us as a Javed UP to be co-hosting this webinar, which is titled The Question of Africanness and the Expanded Field of Sculpture, Part 2, featuring presentations by Melvin Edwards, Curlee R. Holton, and moderated by Prof. George Smith. I will be introducing all the panelists as soon as I speak a little bit about what the Javed Art Center is. The Javed Art Center is a partnership between the University of Pretoria and the Javed Foundation. We all believe in the potential of art in society and its emancipatory nature. And we do this through multidisciplinary curatorial and pedagogic initiatives. The Javed UP is a project that has one food family rooted in academia and the other one embedded in the public. Our role is to critically respond to histories of Africa's creative outputs and the future aspirations of the continent and the diaspora. Central to our commitment is a continuous decolonial dialogue that responds to the present whilst considering the historical and the future implications of our political and social actions. Javed UP is committed to sustained critical inquiries where activities of writers, artists, researchers, advocacy groups, historians, politicians, farmers, scientists, musicians, etc., can intersect. The Javed UP has a feature, which is our bridge gallery, which is a symbolic architectural feature connecting the university and its surrounding communities. This bridge gallery ensures also easy access to all members of the university community. We position ourselves as a living school and an institution committed to creating spaces of unexpected learning together with our publics. We employ long-term pedagogical processes that we hope to nurture a space for transformative processes to take shape through curiosity, discovery, and possibility. Our programs embrace fluidity and experimentation, creating spaces for collective learning and unlearning processes to take shape. We are committed to promoting experimental thinking about the relationship between art and society. Through our multidisciplinary, non-hierarchical collective learning and mediation initiatives, we desire to promote spaces for non-bureaucratized artistic and pedagogical investigations. Our initiatives are led by questions rather than answers. They are self-reflective rather than illustrative. We are committed to cultivating contact zones with schools, individuals, social and advocacy groups, and hybrid institutions surrounding Tshwane and beyond. This webinar is presented and hosted by us here at the Javed UP, the African Center for Study of United States at University of Pretoria, the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts, the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand. Our panelists today include the sculptor, Melvin Edwards, who is a pioneer in the history of contemporary African-American art and sculpture. Melvin was born in Houston, Texas. He began his artistic career at University of South California, USC, Los Angeles, where he was mentored by the Hungarian painter Francis de Elderly. In 1965, the Santa Barbara Museum of Art organized his first solo exhibition. Edwards then moved to New York City in 1967. Shortly after his arrival in the city, his work was exhibited at the Studio Museum in Harlem. In 1970, he became the first African-American sculptor to have a solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Edwards received an honorary doctorate from IDSVA. Curlee R. Holton has been executive director of the David C. Driscoll Center and artist in residence at the Department of Art at the University of Maryland since 2012. The David M. and Linda Roth Professor of Art, Emeritus at Lafayette College, Easton, PA. Holton is a printmaker and painter whose work has been exhibited in prestigious national and international venues such as Egypt's 7th International Biennale in Cairo, the Cleveland Museum of Art, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. His work is in many private and public collections. Holton received an honorary doctorate from IDSVA in 2018. And lastly, but not least, our moderator, George Smith, who is a founder and president of IDSVA, and Edgar E. Kunz Jr., Professor of New Philosophy. He's the author of The Artist Philosopher and New Philosophy from 2018. The Artist Philosopher and Poetic The Artist Philosopher and Poetic Hermeneutics from 2021, and The Artist Philosopher in the Age of Addiction, Heidegger's Climatology, which is forthcoming. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, and as said, to host it as part of the Javed UP's ongoing programs of collaboration. I would like to hand over to the moderator, George Smith. Over to you.
Yes, Gabby, thank you so much. And really wonderful to have you with us today. As everybody probably knows that's joining us this morning, Gabby is surely a great promise of the future of curatorial art forms in the world today. And we're honored to be part of your presence today, Gabby. Thanks so much. And hi, everybody else. It's good to see Curlee, and good to see the other troublemaker that's joining me this morning, Mel Edwards, certainly one of the great sculptural figures in American art, but also obviously a great contributor to the history of art and sculpture in the world today. And Curlee, again, one of the major contributors to the future of the visual arts and cultural consciousness. And we're very grateful to have you both with us. I feel absolutely intimidated to be in the presence of these great giants. And I think that the best thing I can do is pretty much stay the hell out of the way and let Curlee and Mel have at it. They're old cronies, so I'm sure they'll have a couple of really good disagreements. But I want to start with one or two things that kind of pays a little bit of attention to our title, which has to do with Africanness and the expanded field of sculpture. And it does seem to me that when we joined in on the first round of that with Olu Oguibe and Johan, Thom, the assumption was that the expanded field was something recent. But in fact, what we know is that that's not the case at all. The field of sculpture has been expanding forever. And what I would say is that Mel Edwards is very much instrumental in one of the major phases of that field expansion here in the United States, but obviously affecting the world at large in that respect. And of course, Curlee Holton is very much a participant in that historical unfolding, not least by way of his commissioning Mel to design the David C. Driscoll Memorial that will be placed in front of the David C. Driscoll Center when it's completed. So Mel, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you see your place in that historical unfolding of an ever-expanding field, and then Curlee, maybe you could say a word or two about how that whole dynamic comes into play with regard to your participation in Mel's sculptural life as the director of the Driscoll Center. So Mel, really great to see you this morning, and I'm so glad you're with us. Can't hear you, Mel. Can't hear you, Mel.
Afternoon, as you are there. Just very good to see everybody and to be hooked up this way around the world. It reminds me of a question I was asked a few years ago and often gets thrown around in the US, and it's called the Black Arts Movement. And I was asked, my part in that or whatever. And I said, well, first of all, you really have to take the word Black away for a moment and put the word African first. And then once you understand deeply the meaning, the Black Arts Movement was not something that started recently, because it is African art in its absolute furthest extension back in human history. It was there and people made it. It didn't have to be labeled this or that. As so many of the things that we label, we have reasons for labeling things because hopefully it will make things positively functional. It doesn't always work out that way in terms of how things are received, but that is just the reality. The art never, we can't know a human time when art didn't exist in relation to human beings. And it's always been produced by all people on the planet from the beginning. So there's nothing actually new about it. There are always renewals in relation to the circumstances in various places. Some of them good, some of them not so good, but that's just a human reality. So I'm basically just a young man who's a child of his parents and who got encouraged in relation to art. And then I went with it where I could. And sometimes doors opened and sometimes doors were closed. And in a variety of ways, those things happen to everybody. In that respect, I'm not unique. And, it's like we all have a personal life and we all have the life where we're automatically related to everybody else's realities. In other words, Einstein's relativity is a human reality as much as a conceptual one in physics and those things. So anyway, I could run on. An old professor and an ongoing blah, blah. So next, please.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could just, before we jump over to Curlee, maybe Mel, you could say a word about your own making, which is maybe you are not in and of yourself unique, but certainly your making is of a stylistic distinction that brings you to the attention of the world and certainly does relegate you to a place in the history of art and the history of sculpture. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that style comes into development over time. Clearly you're dealing with what I describe as the detritus or detritus of the military industrial complex, which is generally a Western and white complex. How you're able to gather up those remnants and convert them into things of beauty that are themselves deeply historical in their reverberations of the process that they're put through to give us the art that you present to us.
Where or why, but I understood that art could be made of any material and about any subject, and that one could experiment not knowing where one was going and find things. In other words, discovery was a part of it. People talked about and labeled, say, found objects in art and stuff like that. Well, if you find it, something created it, you know. I was once in Zimbabwe and had shown photographs of some of my very large scale public sculpture, which were made of stainless steel and were compositions that were apparently geometric primarily. However, I was showing them to a couple of people involved in industry in Zimbabwe. And the man said, you know, he said, in that one sculpture, you have more stainless steel than we have in all of Zimbabwe, you know. And, you know, we laughed, but what I did know was that the alloys that allowed stainless steel to be created in the world significantly came from Zimbabwe, you know. And so everything in the world interrelates in some kind of way. It doesn't matter what. And they were people who were not happy with the independence of Zimbabwe. And I, of course, was very happy with the independence of Zimbabwe. And you always have opposing ideas about how to work. Things are labeled and called styles, and it's as if you had to work within the parameters of that style. And for me, it didn't matter. First of all, I became a sculptor while I was stopping being a painter, and much of my education was more focused in art on painting. And I just sort of received a batch of photographs of about 12 or 13 of the abstract paintings I was doing in the early 60s as I embarked on the first experiments in sculpture. And I can see the interrelationships, but I doubt if many people can. And it's because what you do visually and what you're doing with your thought processes may not be easily apparent to others. But, you know, it's like improvisation in music. You know, there's music that's written out and is excellent. And then there's the great improvisers in music, you know. And the difference in a symphonic production and a Charlie Parker quartet and the dynamics is the excellence is there in either case, but the time between thinking and getting the work out in that music called jazz is instantaneous, whereas a symphonic composition has to be written out and then transcribed, presented for a bunch of musicians, and then it's done. In other words, it's a larger, more complicated work process. So is the difference between small sculpture and large-scale public sculpture. And I could go on and on about this and ramble, you know, about these things, but they are the dynamics that we encounter. And one of the most important people that I've encountered in my 50 years or more of being involved in modern art and development, and as relates to the United States and Africa, is encountering a man named Demas Nwoko, who's an architect, artist in Nigeria, and who I met in 1970. And we've been in contact ever since. And he's just produced a book of his thinking and thoughts. He developed a concept called New Culture, and he was right at the age where, as Nigeria was getting its independence, he and other younger creative people felt that they had to develop something that was authentic, unique, and inventive. And he did, and for years he's done that. But instead of going and having a major place in Europe, he stayed in Nigeria. That was the intent, so that the contributions and developments were there where they have ancient history, recent history, and the future. And he understood that all of those components are what we work with. And I worked enough with him, and we still call, because these days you can do that like we're doing this. And it's very good to see the possibilities expand. Thank you, George. I'll keep talking, and I don't know where I started. So
for those of you who don't know Mel, he's the one person in the world that says a sentence that never has a period to it. Curlee, great to see you there. And again, I feel so blessed to be in the company of you two guys together in one place. We've done that once before, I know. I would like to mention, Curlee, and maybe you could say more about this, that the Driscoll Center is the Driscoll Center for the Study of African Americans, African American art, and the African diaspora. So maybe you could say a little bit more about the Driscoll Center that you've done so much to bring to where it is today. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about how that development wound up putting Mel Edwards in your company to discuss the possibility of a memorial for David Driscoll. And maybe you'd be so kind as to say a few words about David, because obviously that's very much a part of what we're talking about today.
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, maybe you can turn the volume up a little bit.
Is that a little better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, I'm pleased to be here, and I thank you, George, for inviting me, and of course the host, the institution is hosting this, and the explanation of their institution and mission is really fantastic and very much. I got a little block here. I don't know what that is. Okay, can you still, everything okay? Yeah, I had a little icon come up. But anyway, before I talk about Mel, and I really want to get to Mel because Mel is very modest. I want to pull him out a little bit there. But the Driscoll Center was established in 2001, and it was established to honor David Driscoll and his major achievements as an artist, as a scholar, and as a historian. And he had put together a critical exhibition, 200 Years of Black American Arts, 1750 to 1950, that was shown in Los Angeles to rave reviews. But what's also very important about his career and others that predated him, like Charles, Romare Bearden, James Porter, Elaine Locke, is that David was grounded in telling the story of the African-American cultural experience, especially from the perspective of the visual arts, at a time when that work and that practice and that study and that scholarship was for the most part dismissed and disregarded. So David was doing the real important work, the good work. He was keeping that record alive, he was doing that research, and he was arguing that this material was relevant. Even when he did the 2 centuries in 1976 at the bicentennial, there was still criticism and dismissal of his scholarship and of his work. And that really in many ways represent the struggle that not only David had, but African Americans have had culturally, especially the academics and the scholars, and arguing that the work and what they produced and how they thought, how they felt, and how they interpreted the world was relevant and important. And again, that gets to that issue of objective and subjective. Who has the power to define what something is, what the reality is, and what the worth is? And of course, in the African-American experience, the African-American was always objectified, told what his name was, told what his meaning was, told what his reality was. So this notion that he could create something or she could create something that had validity and value was revolutionary. But that was the trajectory that David Driscoll was on. And the Driscoll Center has tried to celebrate that legacy and advance that legacy. And David was so committed to this mission. But in addition to that, his scholarship, his achievement as an artist, he was an excellent philosopher also. He loved philosophy, studied philosophy. And, sometimes he would surprise you because he would take a turn. He was also sort of influenced by his father, who was a Baptist minister and a sharecropper. So David very much was impacted by his life as a young man and his desire to prove the worth of his family. He was never apologetic about his family, never apologetic about being an African American, never apologetic about his feelings and his thoughts and his intellectual ability, where African Americans traditionally had been dismissed as having any merits in that regard. For example, Finney, the great poet Finney, who won the National Book Award for poetry some years ago, had a line in one of her poems that described a young Black slave boy who had no pockets. And the reason he had no pockets is because he owned nothing to put in the pockets. Why would a slave have any possessions? So you can understand what this meant. So David was suggesting that there were plenty of possessions that were there. The one's experience, one's interpretation of the world from their perspective. So that was David's great argument, and was a humanist in that regard. And that connects to Mel Edwards, who was also a humanist. You can listen to how he described his role as a sculptor in a very general, but very kind of broad way. He was one of many players in this sort of story, in this narrative. He was a character in this narrative. He was contributing, others were contributing, but Mel was doing more than that. Mel was a student of history, not only his own family's history, but the history of African Americans. And Mel has always incorporated that story, that narrative into his practice. I like to think of Bob Marley's song, the Redemption Song. He says in one of his lyrics, "All I have is my redemption song." And that's what David was attempting to do, was to redeem the African American from the legacy of enslavement. That's what Mel's work is about. Mel's work is a sort of pride and high regard for his history. And that history is wide and broad and not to be dismissed. He takes very little credit for being a part of this, but actually, as a sculptor, he uses many tools to forge his great monumental works of art. But Mel Edwards is a tool himself. He's a tool of this legacy. He's a tool of this history. And on this ancestral voyage, he is a tool as well. And I've always thought about him in that regard. So I don't know if he agrees with me, but but he manifests this not only vision, but this journey as well. And I think that's very important about Mel and David's relationship. So Mel Edwards was the perfect artist to create a monumental piece celebrating the history and the legacy and transcendent nature of David Driscoll's work. I've been often asked, well, will it be a realistic portrayal of David? I say, yes, it will be, but it won't look anything like him. You know, so it'll be monumental because David was monumental, his humanity. And George, you know it personally because he was a good friend of yours as well. His spirit was monumental. It was transcendent. And this sculpture is also transcendent and monumental and will embrace the spirit of David, but also connects to the legacy of the African in the New World. And often this is referred to as an African's dream, still having a dream. The dream of the slave, the dream of the African is manifest in the world. So I think these things are all connected. And this notion of Africanness and who defines Africanness, who labels it, who owns it, who titles it is a very important issue for me. Often when I look at works of art, I think about them in terms of what are the arguments that this artist is making? And what is this about in terms of their effort to redeem themselves from whatever dynamic that existed that inspired them to make this work of art? Whether it's philosophical, whether it's an aesthetic argument, it comes from a place of redemption. It is always about redemption. George, I can hear you. Did you hear me okay?
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there you go. Thanks, Curlee. You gave us as much as I have come to expect from you, which is more than I deserve. And yeah, what you say is so true, of course. And I know that you, Curlee, have been a guest at Pretoria, if I'm not mistaken. And maybe from that perspective, you could say a little bit about how you situate the Driscoll Center and your own thinking within this concept of the diaspora. In a way, we could almost go back to what Mel said about the elements in stainless steel that originate in places that one would not expect. But could you say a little bit about the diaspora from your standpoint with regard to what you've said about David Driscoll, but also how you've tied that into Mel's work? Because I think all of this comes together in a way that is incredibly important and certainly ties into the work that Gabby's doing nowadays. And I want to make sure that we pay attention to that future that in a way is an expanded field that begins with people like yourself and David Driscoll, Mel Edwards, so many others. What are you going to say about that, Curlee?
Yeah, I think even when Gabby made the presentation about our institution, there were some key references that really connected to the mission of the Driscoll Center. So it's creating a home for artists, a home for scholars. But more importantly, what it is doing, it is presenting a story. It is telling the story. And the Driscoll Center is really committed to telling this story, telling our story. And that our story is not just the story of African Americans, but how expansive that story is and how that reality has been imagined by African American and African artists of the diaspora, and how we can host that story at the Driscoll Center. Because if we can tell that story, we become the authors of that story. We become the evaluators of that story. We not only get to objectify it and say why is it significant and how it's significant, but we stay subjective as well. And I believe in a deeper sense of subjectivity. So it's important to tell our story from our experience and our perspective without apology. And I think that is exactly what is going on, telling that story and facilitating the telling of the story. So we acquire works of art from artists, we present symposium, panels, we bring in the community to make selections from our collection to, individuals that have no background in the arts other than the love of arts, to come in and make choices from our collection. And then we host that exhibition. We have one up now, telling the story. Yeah. And we invited these 23 individuals in as selectors. They go online, look at our collection, then pick works from the collection. And then they write letters to the artist, whether the artist is alive or deceased, in the tradition of David Driscoll, who was great about writing letters. Yeah. So you wanted to embrace this ideal of the viewer could like a work of art. Normally within our practice in the academy, we don't like to use the term like. We want to have a real critique, a real unpacking, and a real argument. But in this particular case, we embrace this notion that that untrained love of art, when they said they liked something, it embodies something very personal, a relevant reaction that we embrace, that normally we dismissed. So my point is that we are trying to broaden that dynamic in that conversation. David Driscoll was very much like that himself. I've never met an individual who has mentored and empowered so many other individuals. I mean it, I know a lot of important artists, a lot of well-renowned artists, but I've never met anyone that had so empowered individuals, whether his students or mentees across the country. And I was having a conversation with Sam Gilliam, who we lost not too long ago, tragically, about, he was a little jealous of David Driscoll having this major retrospective. And he was a little critical about David's work as an artist. I said, well, no, Sam, they're not coming because of his art, they're coming because of him. I said, there are droves of them around the country coming because every one of them knew David personally. I say, in your case, maybe they're not going to show up as many will show up, but in David's case, he demonstrated such an affection, such a generosity. I witnessed it firsthand. I know Mel has witnessed it, and I know you witnessed it. Yes. So this idea of the humanity in a person of color, giving it a platform, suggesting that it is also important and that it is a voice that needed to be heard and expressed and listened to. That is our message at the Driscoll Center, and that connects us. That connects us around the world. That message and that mission connects us. Because I think that's what we're doing. Yeah. We're attempting to decolonize our realities and to present a fuller story that tells our complete story as humans. That's back to Mel now, that complete story.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Curlee. So beautifully said. And of course, I want to just interject and say that David was certainly a mentor to me. And when I came up with this crazy idea of starting the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts, the first person I went to was David Driscoll, because I knew he wouldn't say to me, "You're crazy."
You're right.
And what he did say to me was that, yes, you're right about this idea. And what we want to do is to make sure that it is an idea that cuts across all perspectives, all races, all nations. And in a way, we've been able to do that, but only because David Driscoll pitched in from the very beginning, not only in terms of his spiritual leadership, but also in terms of his pocketbook. Just a great guy in every respect. And Mel, I'm not sure you're aware of this, but David served as our visiting faculty at Spinocchio Castle for our first year students for a decade. And they always left that experience forever inspired in the terms that Curlee was so eloquently describing. But Curlee, the idea of telling this narrative in a perspective that is peculiar to a given sector of American experience and world experience, I think is so imperative to our understanding of what's going on in the world today with regard to missions such as the new Javits Center and what Gabby is doing and what Mel has been doing all along. It just so happens that we're sitting in the company of two great storytellers. One is, of course, Curlee Holton, and the other one is the guy with the endless sentence, Mel Edwards. But Mel, I have never seen one of your works of art that did not tell an endless story. And in fact, I see your entire oeuvre as kind of a number of chapters in a great narrative. Some of those chapters are deeply poetic and others are historical, but they all link together an overarching aspiration toward a future that comes out of that past that you situate within Africa, within the origins of your own vision, but also within the origins of a certain vision. And I would even say, I was recently looking again at the Bill Buckley, James Baldwin debate at Cambridge University.
Sure.
And, I was amazed to see that what they were talking about was the American dream. I had forgotten all about that. But of course, if there is an American dream, it joins the dream of the world. But to me, and Baldwin was so plain about that, if that dream still existed even back then, it existed within the African American community. It had been totally despoiled by the materialism of the oppressive culture. So, Mel, can you talk a little bit about the story that one sees in one of your works of art, and maybe how that links together your entire history as a leading voice in the world with regard to the meaningfulness of sculpture, which is itself a deeply spiritual mode of representation, right? No. Can't hear you. You'll have to unmute, Mel. Mel.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you see my right hand is Dr. Diallo Toure. And,
Thank you, Diallo.
Technician.
Well, but it's interesting that people use the word storytelling in relation to my work, because I do talk a lot. But in relation to the sculpture itself, through the years, most of my ideas really are improvisations that are developed. And where I start and where the work looks like in the end are often quite different. And I've always had the confidence that I didn't need to know in front what I was doing, but that if I kept working at it, I would do something. And I kind of use a metaphor, which sometimes I'm chided for using, but the difference between realism and abstraction. And I say the only thing you ever create that's real is a baby. And and everything else that leads up to it is abstract until that's the reality.
Yeah.
But conception, mental, conception, philosophical, Well, those roll around everybody's imagination, you know. There's a work of mine at the Driscoll Center that I never would have expected that it would be there or any place. And it showed up in an exhibition of paintings or drawings of portraits of other artists. And this was a painting that I had done, a quick watercolor tempera painting of Benny Andrews, the painter. And Benny and I were good friends. And if you talked about artistic styles, we were as different from each other as midnight and high noon, but we were good friends. And when I moved to New York, Benny was the first artist that took enough interest in my work to want to trade me for work. And so I have a very nice Benny Andrews painting, and he had one of my lynch fragments, that group of smaller works. And but the painting happened because we were working at a center that went out and did demonstrations for elementary school children. Only time in my life I ever consented to be a part of that kind of, you know, interest in children. I like children, but I never wanted the idea of teaching them, certainly not at that age. But anyway, I had some time and I had the materials that were there for the kids, and Benny was sitting nearby. And so unbeknownst to him, I just did this quick kind of drawing painting of him and stuff. And then he realized what I had done a few minutes later. And he says, "You're a sculptor. I didn't know you could paint." And I said, "Look, we all had full educations as artists, you know, in school. And hey, I took life drawing stuff into, you know, I can do that. You know, that's not a big deal." But what he didn't know also was I had spent the first roughly 5 years after basically leaving school painting, and I was just really learning sculpture and teaching myself to be a sculptor, which probably accounts for my free association in ways I developed the work itself. And it can go a variety of ways. I don't know if I answered whatever you asked me a few minutes ago.
Yeah, I never expected you to answer what I'm asking you, Mel.
You better tell me what you asked me, because, but
yeah, you know,
already, if I could comment, because Curlee's discussion and information reminded me of so many things, and that combined with the fact that this program initiates in South Africa. And I had a sculptor friend who was in exile all of his adult life, basically, in the New York area. And he's a sculptor that they do know in South Africa now, but he died the day he got his passport to be able to go back home after 25 years of exile, and that's the sculptor Dumele Fini. And he was a dear friend, and we talked about art and sculpture and the meanings of things, you know, and I got the word that he passed from another South African in exile, the poet Keora Petse Kosetsile, Willie Kosetsile, and who was a dear friend for many years, and who I finally got to see at home in South Africa in, I think it was 2016. And then when I saw he passed away, you know, was big picture in the New York Times and stuff. And I said, well, here's a man who, with the difficulty of his reality, had escaped, and I literally say it that way, from South Africa, because he told me the story of how he had to wade across the Limpopo in a place where it was shallow enough to do that, in the dark, avoiding the possibility of crocodiles or other possibilities. And so I made a sculpture years later called Across the Limpopo, but it was based on the story that Willie gave of his escape to out of South Africa. He became a great poet, and I saw him in Nigeria at Festac. I used to see him often in New York, and it just brings up a whole series of people who stayed creative, who the repercussions of their efforts benefits us all, and will benefit the future. There was an anthropologist when I taught at the University of Connecticut named Bernard Magubani, or Ben Magubani, and he was an anthropologist, but we became friends. This is the period 1970 to 71 and 2. And he had 3 daughters. I had daughters as well, So one of them was a baby. Well, an exhibition of my work, which is in Massachusetts now, public larger scale works, and they had a little talk that I was made, and in the audience turned out to be 2 of Ben Magubani's daughters, and the one who was the baby is now a professor at Boston University, And I had promised Ben that, I said, when freedom comes, Ben, we're going to celebrate and have a beer in South Africa. Well, Ben was still working in the US when things changed, but I had tea with his daughter in Cape Town.
That's so great.
So all I'm saying is life and what we do creatively in terms of art, these stories are not the kind of linear stories of activities or we did this and made somebody famous, but they're that we're all human and are dealing with human realities and how we and the human beings that we're a part of overcome, if not individually, generationally, and if not, again, in one place, but really all over the planet, And Portland, Maine, I played football game in Portland, Oregon. Long time ago, but what I'm just getting at is not only can you find connections that are close and make very good sense in artistic or critical terms, but that creativity comes from all aspects of our experiences. And you get something from everywhere. And the more you go, as far as I'm concerned, it just informs you. You can't learn all the languages because you don't spend enough time with them, but you get something of the qualities of the human beings because you encounter them. You don't always get it right, but usually you get something. And I think this program today, coming together, just again corroborates the effort, and that's important. I don't know if I ever told you what story goes with what in relation to the work, because frankly, for me, every piece is a new experiment.
Sure.
And how much planning in advance? Well, they evolve, and things often get changed so that where I started to go and where I end up are not at all the same place, but it's not important that I do what I started out to do as it is that I completed something that's somehow functional where it will live.
Yeah, I would say that your sculpture operates the same way your storytelling does, though, Mel, insofar as you start out telling one story and you wind up in Portland, Maine.
Well, George, I think, George, your question to Mel and Mel's answer really touches on an important subject. for me is the motivation to practice, what choices we make as artists and as scholars.
Yep.
Having a certain amount of ability, talent, and skill, making those particular choices about our practice. I was in Oaxaca, Mexico, and I was at lunch with Francisco Toledo. And we were talking, and he doesn't talk much. He could speak both English, Spanish, and French, but he was not very tolerant and very patient with Americans that didn't speak Spanish. So I was struggling with it. And he finally asked me what was my project. And I says, well, you know, I'm in Oaxaca, Mexico, looking at some traditional work. I came here to look at Rufino Tamayo's work. He said, no, what is your project? What he was talking about was my project as an artist.
Yeah.
And that has always stayed with me. And that is a very important question, because there's so much art in this world, so many practitioners, and the powers of the art world. Me and Mel have often talking about the canon and what that canon means.
Yeah.
But what that individual artist chooses to do with his talent and his work and his vision and strategies, that choice of practice to me is the most critical choice, regardless of the marketplace. And one thing that we do suffer, especially as people of color, in this post-colonial world we live in, is those kind of colonial and capitalistic, imperialistic powers still ask us to perform out our identity in public.
Right.
The most successful and popular African-American artists are artists that are still perpetuating what I think is a Harlem Renaissance kind of new Negro-ness.
Yeah.
Painting our world, painting ourselves, and presenting it to the public as if it's still exotic and still a mystery to the world. Right. To me, it's diminishing to me. It's suggesting that we don't have any
right.
No genius, no vision, only the presentation of our bodies in a public space for consumption. Yeah. So this is happening all over the world. You see it in Africa, you see it in the West. The marketplace is still interested in this exotic, erotic portrayal of the Black figure and the Black body. That has to stop. We have to demand that other things are considered. Our intellectual life is considered, our vision, our creativity is considered, just not the perpetuation of our bodies to be consumed by the marketplace.
Yeah, I wish I could say it as well as you do, Curlee. I'm right with you on that 100%. And of course, it's just another form of appropriation, right?
Absolutely.
And to me, emancipation is to get over, to get around, to get through that, to really have an identity that's not dependent on responding to the expectation of what that identity is. And again, coming back to Mel's work, obviously, Mel was not paying a lot of attention to those expectations. He went ahead and made great art according to what his muses were telling him to make, rather than what the market was demanding of him. And I think, again, Mel, that brings me back to this notion of jazz that you were talking about before, because, of course, there's a great deal of difference between jazz and the classical canon, and those differences come down to what you were describing. But nonetheless, just as with the classical canon, a Mozart, for instance, when you're done with that piano concerto, you know that you've heard a story. And when you're listening to Art Tatum, when he's done, you know that you're listening to a story. You know, it's the unfolding of a spiritual journey or passage that winds up at a certain place temporarily before it goes on to the next place. And it seems to me that that's precisely what your work does, whereas a classical composition actually does respond to the expectations of a canon, the Western canon. The Western consciousness, Western identification, Western mathematics, for that matter. What Mel, I think, does is purely spontaneous, at least in relative terms to that, where the outcome is not foregone. You know what you're going to wind up with a Mozart, and I love Mozart, but nonetheless, you're going to wind up with a beautifully articulated mathematical equation that all adds up. What I would say with your work, Mel, is a very different kind of narrative, where even as you see one of your works in the instantaneous moment of perception, you really don't know where you're going. And in fact, what I would say about your work is every time I see one of your pieces, it brings me to another part of the narrative that I hadn't seen before. All of that narrative adds up to, in my view, not the human genius that someone like Mozart would have, which is a conceptual genius, but rather a genius that is unique to itself.
You can call it an intuitive genius, George.
An intuitive genius. And what I would say is it's not that it's lacking logic. In fact, what I'm thinking of as I'm saying this is something like what Holton, the great German poet, would call poetic logic, where in fact there is an enormous amount of logic that informs, for me at least, Mel, your process. But nonetheless, it's still open to not what you're trying to say, but what comes into you from outside, from the muse, call it whatever you want to, those ancient roots that compel you in ways that are almost unconscious to arrive at a place that you yourself have not yet anticipated. It's not your work is not a foregone conclusion when it begins. I feel embarrassed that I'm telling you what you do. So forgive me, shut up and ask you to correct me.
No, I'm not correcting you, but I'm just thinking of the variety of realizations that have come to me about myself in my life. And when you mention the term logic, that always buzzes me when anybody uses a term, and it's a personal reaction, and nobody would know why. I've confessed it a few times. The only class in my years in the university that I absolutely failed was a course in logic.
Well, you know, had you taken
no, but wait, but I understood I just couldn't, something was too dense or something, and I was a person who read a lot, and so that wasn't the issue. I just, the language and the way the structure of things were in the book, it was like mathematics. And then I realized, well, the only course I had absolute trouble with in high school was algebra. And it took me 5 semesters to get through 3 semesters of it. So, but what I'm getting at is what through the years, I always liked reading philosophy, always encountering things where people were discussing how they think or how life is thought. And when you spoke of Mozart, and I think Charlie Parker, or more modernly than Charlie Parker, though that's hard to say, and Ornette Coleman, you know, but various people who turned jazz into what they called the new music from roughly 1960 onward. But really, it was always just music. It was labeled structurally as people comprehended what was going on from one period to another. And though the documentation for Western classical music is much more thorough and complete, the levels of evolution in the world's music, the music of China, the music of India, the musics of, you know, everywhere, it's all equally dynamic, equally material for further evolution, and human beings always do that. One of the definitions or expressions of a quasi-definition for the word jazz is they say, well, you know, there's no such, you know, word. And it was asked of the poet Jane Cortez, who used those dynamics in music, sound, and language. And she said, well, jazz is just an African word for music. And immediately somebody responded, well, what African language is that in? She said, it's the African language of Africans in America. In other words, we did not stop evolving creatively or otherwise because we moved from one continent to another. And so in the use of language, there are a lot of other words that we don't dare use, which were invented. But the point is that their ability to express human emotions or quality are valid, you know, and the validity or their use and function for human beings is absolute, you know. But at the same time, we have our, well, these words you don't use in polite conversation or this or that, but at the same time, we know they're valuable in terms of expressing. And so it is with form and ideas in visual art. And visual art has the same extensive, wide open future, is what we do and what we perceive that those things could consist of. The argument between abstraction and realism, well, that's a good drink at a bar. You can have a long conversation and you're still going to be in the vicinity at the end where you were when you started. It's just the glass will be empty.
Which glass?
Well, I don't, because I don't remember which glass you served me. I'm just taking them one at a time.
Yeah.
But I think putting together programs like this, that should help to stimulate people understanding their connectedness, no matter how far. And of course, with the technology these days, we can, be much closer to each other, no matter how far we are actually in physical presence. But it also means that our ideas can intersect much more rapidly. And hopefully, we or the generations that are coming will make really a positive use of what evolved, because certainly the last 100 years, the quantity of changes of possibility for human being it's literally like the atomic bomb. The explosion of nuclear explosion of ideas, technology, and human understanding of how much we can expand. And we already thought we were complex, but the truth is it's going to expand much more, and it makes sense. But I'm having trouble enough dealing with what we've had to deal with and work here, so I just think it's all good. And I have no finality kind of comments in relation to it, because anything that we say, as we discussed today, if we were, or have somebody else do it 2 months from now, there'll be qualities that weren't there in ours. It just keeps moving.
Yeah, it does. Beautifully said.
It's connected. Yeah.
Curlee, I can't get Mel to say anything nice about his work. He just says it's like everybody else's. And I understand that.
A quick addition. I just went on Monday to the memorial for our friend Sam Gilliam.
Yep.
And given the generations, people who are in their 80s and so, and then a smaller personal celebration for the painter Bill Hudson, who, like me, his origins were in Texas, and so. And now when I think of names and stuff, the list of who I encountered and who I was excited to meet and to know through the years, and I can't call them on the phone anymore, because if I get them, I'm not in the place I want to be. You know what I mean? But what I'm getting at is their contributions, as we discussed David and that generation. Well, Curlee's a printmaker. Bill Hudson's a printmaker. I just went again in this month to a celebration of Ben Wigfall, the printmaker in upstate New York at SUNY New Paltz. And I had done some work with him, and that reminded me of the printmaker Bill Majors, who, when I first came to New York, I met. He was a guard at the Museum of Modern Art, but he got me my first teaching job in the East at Orange County Community College. All of us have intersected and interacted, and of course, I've credit with Curlee. There's just something that pulls us together and at the same time sends us all back out into the world to relate to other people, and they feel connected. I could go on and on. There are phone calls that have been coming this last month from Germany, but they're the son of a important sculptor in Zambia named Henry Tayali, who passed some years ago. And this son is now involved in art a bit himself. He's learning, though he's 50 years of age or so. But it's because he saw my name attached to his father. Well, I had dedicated a sculpture by title to his father because I had seen a sculpture at the University of Zambia of a graduate. And this graduate was about 18 feet tall, and it was made of cement. And he was in university regalia with, the typical square-cornered hat and stuff. But in his hand, instead of a diploma, he had an adze, the traditional adze for digging in the ground or carving. Yeah. And the language related to the sculpture was, if you want to accomplish something, you have to dig for it. And of course, that's ancient knowledge. It's like, if you want to grow something, you have to plant the seeds. It's that kind of metaphor. Sure. Well, here it is, his son, 50 years after he died, the father, and the son is serious now about trying to be creative himself, and you never know where your legacy, or if not legacy, the thoughts and the activities that you were involved in were meaningful. Well, when I saw that sculpture at the University of Zambia, it's not the kind of work stylistically I would have been associated with, but the metaphor, the meaning there, that was incredible for me, and that's what we all have had to do in order. And I would say, even George, for your creation of the Institute, it's something that has to be cultivated, in order for the positive results. Curlee's activities at Lancaster, it's not Easton. Sorry, Curlee, I've got my Pennsylvania towns mixed up, but it just means to me, all of us have aspects that can be connected to somebody else. They're not necessarily perfect connections. And even sometimes we misconnect when we're trying to connect. But the main thing is that we're creatively trying to do something, if you will. It's like, I remember older people saying to me when I was a kid in Texas, well, boy, you're not doing nothing. You got to do something. You can't just sit there. You got to do something. And they don't say what. They're not limiting you or saying, if you do this, it's not good. Or if you do that, it's better. They're just saying, you've got to try to do something, And I think that's broad enough that it fits positively all of us.
And that connects also to David Driscoll's vision for the Driscoll Center. He used to talk about the mission being this idea of replenishing the field. Mm-hmm. And I suggested to him that it wasn't about replenishing the field, it was about expanding the field. If you expand it, it will take care of the replenishing itself. So that in that mission statement now, it says expanding the field. and broadening the field, that is, and it's connected to what you're talking about. The legacy exists because you give opportunities to others to sit at the table and be a part of it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure.
Yeah, well, Curlee, David did accede to your suggestion there. At least he negotiated a settlement. He'd say to me all the time, grow the field. So that includes both concepts.
Yeah.
Grow the field. You got to grow the field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you do that by opening up your arms to others. And
Precisely, and embracing the gift. Absolutely right.
Absolutely.
Mel, listening to you, I think you make me think that in a certain way, all meaningful art, all historically significant art, and that's not to say that it's significant because a curator says that it is, but because it's going to be, or it is, or it's becoming such 50 years hence, whatever the case may be. And whether it's narrative or jazz or classical composition or painting or whatever, that at a certain level it becomes absolutely poetic, which is to say that it actually speaks across disciplines.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it's electronic engineering, art tatum, architecture, whatever, it speaks across disciplines and joins in on a harmonic expression of the human spirit in search of emancipation from this place of the absolute gift of human beingness, right? That it recognizes that gift of human beingness that you always speak about in one way or another, Curlee and Mel. I know, Curlee, you are a great poet. You don't talk about that very much. I've read your poetry. It's just an amazing expression of the human spirit. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you decided on Mel Edwards to design this David Driscoll Memorial, because of course David also was a great poet in another way. He didn't write much poetry, but certainly all of his work expressed that heightened expression of the human spirit that comes forward in all great art and in all great literature and all great architecture and all great electrical engineering, for that matter, or quantum mechanics, as Curlee was alluding, as Mel was alluding to earlier. Maybe you could say something about how was it that you came to Mel to give us this monument?
Because it's really at the foundation of my work, and I know it was connected to David's. David was very much a romantic artist, very romantic in his work. But there was also a lament, and I think of my work as having a sort of profound lament, a crying out, a calling out, a reaching out to others, wanting to extend through that visual language, to that creative expression, a hand to touch another hand. It's as I mentioned, a lament. Well, David was very much about reaching out through his artwork. It was very affectionate, as I mentioned, very romantic, very redemptive. Well, Mel's work is that also. The only difference with Mel's work is if you bump into it, you might get injured because it's so, but it is, I've seen, there's a piece at Lafayette College that Mel was commissioned to do called Transcendence. And this is in honor of David K. McDonough. David K. McDonough was one of the first African American slaves to actually go to college and receive a college degree. And I think it was in 1859 that he got his degree. And the 49 eyes, ears, nose, and throat doctor, African American eyes, ears, and throat doctor. Well, Mel's piece was in honor of David K. McDonough. But the piece, people coming around, students standing next to it, they take photographs with it. The piece is not just monumental, but it creates a space where one can embrace their past and their history and give permission. So I think David did that. I try to do that in my own work, as you mentioned, the poetry and also the prints and the paintings is about a certain kind of crying out or calling out, a call and response, if you will. And that can be very poetic. It can be full of song. Most of the musicians I like are engaged in that, whether that's Luther Vandross or Frankie Beverly and Mays. The songs are about a desire, a reaching out, and they want that desire to be met, and they want that call to be heard. They want that lament to be engaged. So that is, to me, a human expression, a human desire. And so that my writing comes from that same place. My work comes from that same place. My being is about that. And I think David Driscoll's being was about that as well, to create something that didn't exist previously, to make it known, to make it present. Yeah. The great artist Al Loving said that to me once. He said, artists create things that don't exist because they want them to be present. Mm-hmm. They want the argument to be present. They want the principle to be present. They want the song to be present.
You know, Curlee, in relation to that sculpture at Lafayette, dedicated to David McDonough, and of course, because of that involvement, I got a lot of information, excuse me, on his life. And, you know, and I gathered he was the plantation product of the McDonough family and their interests as they were in Louisiana and Mississippi. However, in that era, the 1800s, and even a century before, commerce and everything else flowed by ship, so that Baltimore, Charleston, Mobile, New Orleans, Galveston, that was the route, the passageway on the continent, you know, and connections to Africa and South America and the Caribbean. Well, in being here in Baltimore, I found where the McDonough family's holdings are here.
Yes.
And there's a commercial development with McDonald Road. One section of McDonald Road goes across one of the freeways that I cross or use often. And one day I decided to follow the primary road that had the name. And all of a sudden, here's a large farm area still owned by, I presume, the McDonough family or interest, but it's a school. Yeah, you know, it's high school or, you know, something like that, but private. And there was plowing going on in the field, you know. It wasn't cotton, I don't think, you know. And I always like to use cotton as the big metaphor for our history, though everything we know was planted and grown. But I stopped across the street because there was a farm stand of fresh vegetables that had grown there. And there was a house that looked like it might have been from the late 1800s or something like that. And I asked the people who were selling the vegetables, you know, if they had anything to do with McDonough or the family. They didn't know anything about the history or any of that. And of course, I didn't tell them about my work or my interest. You know, I just looked and observed, and I said, you know, I could, in my mind, in my imagination, this great profit-making enterprise of his family, which was intercoastal in the United States and ultimately went east across the ocean to Liberia. So there's a town in Liberia named Baltimore, you know. I mean, there are all kinds of connections that you find. And then in following up the information I was getting from the project, evidently the McDonalds were active with the Presbyterians. Well, it happened that in my family, I grew up in a Presbyterian family church household, you know, and so I knew something about them. And I, you know, not in a judgmental way, but I began to understand that these religious organizations were corporate as well. And they always are, and actually always have been. You know, they never miss a collection serving, as we do. You know, anybody who's going to church. But what I'm getting at is these interrelated contacts of peoples bring information. And while I'm a sculptor, I'm naturally involved in aesthetic discoveries and revelations. You find them through all kinds of things that you didn't expect necessarily that to be the topic or the information that's shared. And when I was in South Africa, you know, I stood with my stepson at the place called Cape Point, which is as far south as you can go in Africa. And I said to myself, well, we've been in Egypt and Morocco, where it's been as far north as you can go in Africa. I've been to Nairobi on the east, and Dakar and the cities along the western Gulf Coast of Africa. And I've had the same experience in the United States. I was born in the Gulf of Mexico, lived and was educated on the Pacific coast, and have lived on the Atlantic coast for, you know, and you realize it's quite possible, just in doing what you're trying to do, that you get to know this planet that we're on, these people in the world that we all live with, and these multiple aesthetic systems that human beings keep inventing and reinventing. And at the same time, somehow we still keep communicating. You know, we do keep, if you will, communicating poetically, as you referred to, Curlee, you know, that, well, it's all poetic. It's all a beautiful experience. Sometimes difficult, sometimes easy, sometimes fun, you know. And as me and my little 8, 9-year-old buddies used to say when I lived in Dayton, Ohio, we'd go down to this natural sand pile, which nowhere near any ocean or water or anything, but if you dug in the dirt there's a big pile of sand. That must be geology. I don't know what it was, but we would get together on summer mornings. We said, okay, let's meet down at the sand pile. We're going to sit down there and tell some lies, meaning we were going to talk and tell stories.
Yeah.
And if you take the word lies and translate it to the word fiction, then you know what that makes it nicer. But we love to say lies. You tell lies. You use your imagination. And people, we just made each other laugh for, you know, the whole morning till it was time to go home, you know. And I think that's about creativity. You just keep doing it and using your imagination. You keep pulling up things that you know and things that you don't know, you know. Yeah, and it gives you something, but it gives other people thoughts. You may introduce a thought for one reason, but where somebody else's reception of it takes it somewhere else. And that's a spreading of the good news, if you will.
You know, Mel, that power of that sculpture also brings the story of David K. Madonna forward from the shadows of history.
Oh, yeah.
It makes that permanent. It makes the story monumental and inspiring. So art can be redemptive, as I explained, not just redemptive for the maker, but redemptive for the community that that encounters the work as well.
No, absolutely, you know, and any number of things that there's a form that I use, sort of pulled out of one of my earlier pieces, and I use it independently, and it's called column of memory or chain columns, that vertical, but people presume chains out of slavery again. Come on, you know. So, well, no, you've got to look into the meaning of the word chain. You got to look into the functional use of chains. Why were they invented? Chains existed way before slavery, you know, and certainly the, you know, post-1500 international slave trade from Africa, it's way before that, you know, and all over the world, blacksmiths who made chains, well, the real question was it strong enough to do its job? It was an improvement on twine or rope for securing things and being flexible. And a chain is as strong as its weakest link. You know, that's a metaphor, but it's also a truth. At the same time, it's a metaphor for being connected, that one generation is linked to another, that one group of people are connected to others and their own, it's just a matter of the relativity that one uses to approach the language, or the relativity that one uses to create form, and so it's what you do with it, that's really what it amounts to. And what you haven't done is still there to be developed, potentially. Yeah.
Thank you, Mel. Did I interrupt you, Mel? Were you just, did you?
Anytime you say something, you interrupt me, because I might say something another.
I come to you with an apology in hand.
Please interrupt me. Please interrupt me, George, because I think this is a great exchange, and every time Curlee and I get to talk, George, I haven't had a chance to talk that much with you, but Curlee and I have thrown more than a few words together, and each time we finish, we know we could have talked longer, so.
Yeah. Well, my wife will ask me to call you to get a piece of information, Mel, and I'll give you a call and we'll talk for 2 or 3 hours telling stories. And then my wife will say, well, did you find out? I'll say, oh, yeah, I forgot all about that. But, Curlee, what you were saying about the way certain kinds of art, and certainly this you were referring to Mel in these poetic terms, creates a space within which unanticipated miracles can unfold, one of which is coming into the place of oneself, I think. And for some reason, you got me to think about Mel's work and language in terms that I had thought of, metaphorically perhaps, but not with words. And that is the striking, forgive me for using this big word, but juxtaposition between the materials, the discarded industrial materials, the metal, which you think of as noisy and violent and forcing one object to become something else, or one material into some other productive form. But when you get close to that sculpture, you find yourself in a space that is actually quiet, even silent and gentle. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, Curlee. I know that Melvin, he does something, he tell you, no, you're wrong. but what have you got to say about that, Curlee?
I think you're right about that. It repurposes material in a different kind of way, especially with Mel's stainless steel objects. But you're right, it's monumental, it's imposing, and then it's quiet. We're actually building a plaza in front of the Driscoll Center for the installation of the sculpture. So the university got inspired by this and said, we want to build a plaza and make it so people will come and be able to be around the sculpture. So it creates this quiet space. I think you're absolutely right. It's such large and monumental work, but it gives you permission to reflect. And also the material itself is reflective of light.
Sure. Yeah.
And the way Mel's masterful use of space and shape and form is really amazing. But it also talks about repurposing material and representing material that is normally used for other kind of reasons. And this connects also to the art of Africa. A lot of the art made in Africa now is repurposing material that is indigenous to Africa, or rooted in Africa, or found in Africa, recontextualized to turn into objects that are sculptures or wall pieces. This is very popular, and this idea of redeeming material that is thrown away. And that also connects to the experience of African Americans. That material that had been thrown away is then repurposed and infused with a different kind of spirit. And I think Mel's sculpture has done that as well. It references something very historical, something monumental, but at the same time, it gives refuge and space so that you can reflect on it and you can come together around it. So it gives permission. So I think you're right about that.
Yeah.
There's a number of those things.
a quick one in relation to that, Curlee. Nobody would think that, I don't think anyway, that this kind of sculptor I am and stuff, you know, in the ways you've described it. And I can say that probably the earliest influence, and influence may not be the right word, but recognition of form and shape and reuse of materials comes from watching my mother or my grandmother make biscuits in the old days. Because they make the dough and stuff and roll it out, and it's flat and it's laid out, and then you take a drinking water glass or cup and they press it onto the dough and cut out the form of the biscuit. Well, you get the biscuit form, but you get all of the dough that's left around the cut. And of course, they don't throw it away. They just roll it back up and repurpose it, and it's more dough, and it gets through the process, and there's not a scrap of it left, and it all gets baked. And you say, well, excuse me, being trained in the art world, you know, art school and all of that kind of thing, and learning, and then going to the scrapyard and buying cutouts, you know, in other words, the biscuit parts taken out and the shape is there in the steel, they're circles or triangles or whatever, and they just become shapes and forms to work with, you know. But conceptually, the main thing is that, you know, no, it still is material for eternity. It's just a matter of, it may change its function, it may change its place in our knowledge bank, and then it goes where we choose to repurpose it or use it, you know. And of course, all over the world, whether people are making beautiful things or making war, materials are never finished with. They're dug up and repurposed. You know, they're always used, and that's both negative and positive. It's incredible how human beings have the capacity to recognize that something in the form that you find it has other purposes or possibilities. And that's true in art, because art, what's true in art is just the reality of what's true in life. You know, it doesn't, we give it that three-letter word art and therefore put it on a bit of a pedestal. But the truth is, the ways of making art are the ways of making life. You know, that just is perennial. And we didn't start it, and we won't stop it, you know, and hopefully we can do something to assist the positive part of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Mel. You know, we've got great storytellers here, two great poets, Curlee and Mel. So of course we're already running over time, and we haven't even had a chance for any questions. Angela Lynn, do you have any questions posted?
There are not any questions in the Q&A box yet, but if people would like to start.
Yeah, I know that Curlee is pressed for time, so maybe I would ask you one question, Curlee, and then I know you've got to see to other obligations. Curlee, maybe you could say something about your own life as it brings you here today in this conversation, which is to me incredibly special to have you two people here to swap ideas and talk about not just the past, but also the present and the future in the incredibly poetic terms that you're able to articulate. Can you say a little bit of something about how your life, you know, how you grew up and how you got from the sand pit to the Driscoll Center directorship?
Sure, a lot of it was by accident. I often describe.
Tell me about your lives.
Yeah, as a Ben Arrow, in that it took me a long time to make this kind of choice. I had grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, went to school, got drafted into the military during the end of Vietnam, came out, went to night school with a family for 10 years to get my first degree and made those kind of choices, began to practice as an artist. And I wrote a letter to a very famous artist, Mel will appreciate this. I wrote a letter to Elizabeth Catlett in Cuernavaca, Mexico. And I asked Elizabeth Catlett, could I come and study with her? And I said, I'll do anything. I'll mop your floors, clean the studio, rub your back, anything I can, get into that chain that Mel was talking about.
Yeah.
And I never heard anything back. And then one morning I get a call from Robert Blackburn out of New York City. And he says, I understand you're going to see Elizabeth Catlett. I says, I don't know what you're talking about. I says, I wrote to her, she never replied. He said, well, call her right now. I says, call Elizabeth Catlett right now on the phone? He said, yes. So I called her and she says, you know, Bob has it all wrong. I called him and told him to give you a fellowship because she had had back surgery and couldn't post any kind of intern or fellow. And that's how I got to Bob Blackburn's in New York City. And I traveled from Cleveland, Ohio on a train on Thursday nights at 12 o'clock, got into Grand Central Station in the morning, stayed for 3 days, and then went back to Cleveland because of my family. I did that for 2 years, going back and forth to New York City. So that was that one phone call from Bob Blackburn.
Yeah.
The second phone call that changed my life happened at Bob Blackburn's. There was a phone call that he received from Robert Madison at Lafayette College, the chair of the art history department. And he said, I was told to call you by the artist Grace Hardigan. And they called Bob Blackburn because they were looking for an African-American artist that also had lectured in art history. And I did both, and I had some things published as well. So Bob Blackburn brought me that phone and says, answer this call, Curlee, before I tell anybody else in the workshop about this. And I got that interview. That was the second phone call that changed my life.
Yeah.
And of course, the third one was David Driscoll. I was at Lafayette College, and David Driscoll came as a guest artist to do a lecture to the art history class. And I was teaching African-American art history as well. I was teaching printmaking. And we met him to bring him into the class, and I was so excited. I was teaching his text in my class, and all my students were very excited. David Driscoll, this book, you know, we were learning from this book, and the author is walking into the room to lecture. And he lectured. It was a wonderful talk. And at the end of it, we had a dinner, and he said he had one request. He said he knew that Mel Edwards and William T. Williams and Faith Ringel had worked with me at EPI, the workshop. And he says, can he work with me also? So this is this guy. He said, I want to be with the rest of them. I want to go with Mel and William T. and all the rest. So that's how I started working with David. And as a result, he became not only a mentor, but a friend. And I did his first international exhibition I organized in Mexico. We traveled to Costa Rica. We traveled to Tokyo together. I mean, I did a lot of work with him, and it was a very special moment. So the way in which I came to the Driscoll Center, I was on the board of the Driscoll Center. They had a failed search, and the former director pleaded with me to consider being the interim director for just 1 year while they remounted the search. That was very deceptive of Bob Steele, who did this to me.
I knew Bob.
I agreed. And that turned into 12 years now. This is
Yeah.
So, well, 10 years now. But I was a chairman of the art history, chairman of the art department at Lafayette College. I was running Experimental Printmaking Institute and coming back and forth to the Driscoll Center. I had those positions, and it was quite a challenge. But I did that because I had such respect and love for David. But it's an interesting discovery. At first, I was a little uneasy about it. I had, raised money to support my own institution, the Experimental Printmaking Institute. But these were different challenges. This was a larger responsibility, more staff, more fundraising, as you can imagine. I was a little intimidated by that because Bob Steele was a very effective fundraiser. We used to call him the Rainmaker because he really knew how to do this. But I realized something later on after a few years that I was probably the perfect person for the position because I had not only practiced as an artist, I taught African and African-American art history. I had a relationship with David, so I could actually speak about the center with such a certain kind of authority and a certain kind of authenticity that had not been present before. So I think that was sort of meant to be. And so now I'm coming to the conclusion of that. I'll be departing the Driscoll Center June of 2023. The new successor has been appointed and is coming in. And I did things a little different, George. She's been working with me for the last year. When I came in, I walked into Bob Steele's office and he walked right out. So this is a little different this time. But the goal was to make the center more responsive to the community, to bring a different kind of dynamic to the scholarship, especially with the philosophy and the archives and the collections. We've expanded on the space, the collections. We're becoming a preferred location for the collections of African-American artists from around the country. So in many ways, I brought something to the center that I think was valuable, but it's time for it to become even more. And we consider ourselves a research institute that has a phenomenal collection, both our collection and archives. And I think we're one of the 3 top research and study institutes in the country for African-American art.
Yeah, I don't doubt that in the least. Thanks so much for saying all of that, Curlee. I'm just imagining the younger people in our audience that need to hear what you and Mel are saying in terms of how it's so important to not only be open to the miracle of those 3 telephone calls, but in fact to initiate the miracle with the letter that you wrote out of the blue in the first place.
You have to take action.
And you know that's a miracle because I'm sure you said to yourself, she'll never answer me.
No, but she did.
Right? And yet, of course, you're sitting there today because you took that step. And you know, Mel, thinking of you in those terms, it's just natural for you to think that you're watching your mother and your grandmother make biscuits and that they're using a cup as opposed to something that's been, you know, manufactured to cut the things out, but they're repurposing something else to actually cut the form of those biscuits, and then reusing the leftovers to make more biscuits. You know, millions of kids see that.
Sure.
But once in a while, a miracle comes along. It's called a young artist that's in the kitchen with that mother and that grandmother that sees something that will inform the rest of their lives, just like that letter did. And it comes from an accident that brings together the seeds of a miracle, the soil and the seeds of a miracle, and then gives us what we have today, which is Mel Edwards and Curlee Holton.
Absolutely. It's what you do with those accidents, George.
Exactly right. I know you've got to jump. I'm going to stick here with Mel for another minute or so, but of course, as Mel said, we didn't say it all, that's for sure.
Appreciate the dialogue, as Mel had said. This is a wonderful exchange, and I hope it continues. Best wishes to everyone.
As a matter of fact, I think we have an appointment. Of course, I don't remember the date, but you'll remind me.
Soon come.
You'll remind me.
As they say in Jamaica, soon come. All right.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Curlee. Talk to you soon.
Greetings to the family.
All right. Thank you.
And Mel, you know, needless to say, it's an amazing grace to be in your presence, knowing that there are young people listening to what you have to say, and knowing that, in fact, just in speaking, you're growing the field in ways that very few people in the world could today. I wonder if you could say another word or two, at least, about the projects that you have underway now. You've obviously got the Driscoll Monument on the board, but what else have you got going on?
Well, I guess I'll go with the largest one, which is for the Crenshaw district in Los Angeles. It's, of course, on the West Coast, and I'm here in the East Coast. We're actually fabricating. In fact, the fabrication is basically completed at the ARJ Fabrication Company in Trenton, New Jersey, who I've worked with for over 25 years on larger scale work. And they're very good to work with and handle the work well. But the project is for Crenshaw Boulevard in Los Angeles, in the western part of the city. There's a rail line that's been extended from the airport into that part of the western part of Los Angeles. And the rail line that they're extending intersects with another rail line that goes to the center of the city. But this Crenshaw district is historically significant for earlier on Japanese Americans, and very much so since the 40s and 50s African Americans. And it's a community on the edge of it is actually where I had my first studio. And so they weren't aware of that, but I was in a building owned by an Afro-American ceramics person of the generation or so older than me named Tony Hill. He had a commercial ceramics enterprise on Jefferson Boulevard, and I worked for him. And then he had a building on the corner of Vernon and Van Ness, which the California Eagle newspaper was in. It's a very important historic African-American newspaper. And then one of the storefronts in there, he rented to me very economically. And in that garage out back of it is where I made my very first welded steel sculpture. And this is probably only a dozen blocks from where the piece of mine that's going to be 35 feet high, links of chain as far as identifiable form, and stainless steel. So it will be quite an eye catcher just because of its scale and dynamics. But for me, it's symbolic. Members of my family have lived in that area in Los Angeles through the years. And I first saw the street in 1951 when it was really not significantly African-American and full of new automobile showrooms, which disappeared years ago. But what I'm getting at is sometimes where your work goes when it's public work has implications beyond what you realize when you start, you know. And I think that's the pleasure of public art is where you start with it and where it goes in the lives of human beings is very important. And you could say, if the saying, go west, young man, go west, well, that's as far as you can go until you get into the water, you know. And I'm happy about that with my sculpture.
Right. Well, I have a message here from Johan Thom, and then I'll pose a question for you, Mel. I'm going to have to jump for a second. I'll come right back. Johan Thom says, I just want to say thank you very much to everyone for this wonderful talk from the School of the Arts at the University of Pretoria. We are incredibly thankful for your time and efforts, and to the speakers specifically for sharing your wisdom so generously with us. Kind regards, Johan Thom. And a question, Mel, if you have time for at least one. Actually, let me just see if I can find the question.
George,
Yes.
I have a question in the chat box.
Okay, great. If you could ask that, I'll be right back with you. Go right ahead, Simona. Thank you.
I wonder if you can read it because it's noisy here.
Oh, okay.
Of course.
Maybe Angela Lynn can take care of it. I'll be right back.
Okay, I'll do that. This question is from Simonetta. As you work on the David Driscoll Memorial, what are your guiding principles in terms of memorializing and monumentalizing a figure of such significance in the arts and African culture? And how does that play with your approach to
American culture? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Arts and American culture. How does that play with your approach to sculpture more generally?
That's almost too abstract a kind of question. It's way too broad. I mean, it's a good question, but what I mean by that is I don't work generally one idea to illustrate another idea. The work tends to inform, if you have to use words to describe aspects or qualities, the languages have to be poetic or, you know, because otherwise I give you a simplistic, I don't know, You know, in terms of the way the question is phrased, there are no individual forms that say this represents David in any more than it does any other human being, because it's not a figurative work. And what I find, you know, and this is maybe to play more with your question, to play with it than to answer it. And people often ask of works that are abstract and symbolic, they want something that gives them a figurative, realistic answer. And that's just not logical. So I would say that, well, for instance, I think I described a moment or two ago the column in Los Angeles in the Crenshaw district. I made a smaller variant of that idea about 15, 20 years ago in Dakar, Senegal. Nobody commissioned it. I just decided I wanted to make a variant of this column of memory concept. And I went to a steel worker, fabricator, who had been allowing me to come and work directly on small things in his workshop. And with his cooperation, I made this about 13 or 14 foot high variant of one of the chain columns. And then in my own family, personal intentions, I had built a house in the outskirts of Dakar in a place called Deni Melik Geye, where people were village farmers. I had, with the artist Suleiman Keita, I had gotten 6 or 7 hectares of land, and I built a small house and then had a little workspace outside of it. And I celebrated the house, and I installed the sculpture outside, and between the sculpture was standing with the house at one point, the sculpture, and then about 100 yards further out in the field was this very large baobab tree, which was probably 200 years old. And my personal emotional or reasoning and thought was that, well, in my family, we'd been away 200 years. And I had gone home to Africa, built a house, a dwelling, planted seeds and grew peanuts, and at the same time built a sculpture that was between the house and the big baobab. And we celebrated, and it was me and artists and friends there in Senegal. Well, about 2 years later, the government wanted the land my house was on, and they were building and commemorating a historical school that had been used in the period of colonialism that people like Senghor and stuff had gone to. Well, now they wanted this land so they could expand and more memorialize it. They knew nothing of my private work in relation to me and my family and our history and our emotions. But anyway, my friend Suleiman Keita said, look, we just have to sell the land or they'll just take it. So I got enough money out of it to buy a very used old Peugeot station wagon, which can get me around. But what I'm getting at, I then took the sculpture and eventually I donated it to the city of San Luis in the north of Senegal, which is right on the edge of the water and the lagoon and where the Senegal River goes into the Atlantic Ocean. If you will, metaphorically and possibly actually, it was the last spot in Africa that somebody coming in the slave trade would have seen of Africa before they ended in the Americas. that piece is there at the Comptoir de la Fleuve in Saint Louis. And in relation to that, the city of Saint Louis made me an honorary citizen of Senegal. Now, I haven't worked out absolutely in advance the meanings of the work that I'm doing for David. I've made several variations experimentally, and I don't try to develop the ideas in advance to predict what I will put or what will develop into the sculpture. So you could say, like, improvising and developing a musical composition. I'm still playing with the ideas of the forms and the shapes, as a pianist would compose by playing with the possibility of those 88 keys on the piano and the multiple combinations possible, you know. So, but that, I've always avoided the kind of narrowness that your question asks, you know. Maybe I'm just ducking being irresponsible, but I've found that, no, it allows me more freedom in the work.
Thank you, Mel.
Which, by the way, David would have said, well, that's okay. Because the reason I can say that is he did come to the inauguration of the piece at Curlee's college, and at Curlee, and complimented it very much. So he'll be okay with what I did, you know.
I don't doubt that. No, we have maybe just one more question, Mel. We've taken up more of your time than we've certainly deserved. But we have a question from Chinedum Muroto. Can you speak?
Yes, I can speak. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Chinedum Muroto. I am originally from Nigeria, Lagos. I am Igbo, and I'm calling in now from Dublin, Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question kind of like begins with a preface and then goes into the question, but very short of, I really resonate with what you said around found objects, because in entering into sculpture and in making items, it has been from this point of deprivation in which I have gravitated towards found objects, and particularly metal. And also I'm trying to link that into, for example, the Haitian Revolution and the role that blacksmiths played. And I think my question that I want to ask you as a sculptor and as a man that has been in this quote unquote game for so long, what is the future that you hope to see primarily for African artists working in the medium of sculpture? And especially when you mentioned that whole role of public art and the impact that it has on people's lives as it moves.
Well, there are already, since independence in Nigeria, and I'll focus Nigeria just because I have been there many times, and it's a very important place to me personally. Benin and the Oba of Benin, the present Oba, was a graduate student at Rutgers University in the 1980s, working, I believe, in public administration and stuff. And of course, he's since been a diplomat, and for the last 7 years or so, the new Oba of Benin. And I've been going to Benin since 1971, and very familiar with the bronze casters, the families of Chief Omoregbe Ine and his son Daniel Ine, and they keep me apprised of what's going on in Nigeria. But also the contemporary artists in Nigeria have been important to me. And I'm saying it this way because if you're from Nigeria, if you're Igbo, there are already concepts and structures, historic and modern, that you already have access to. And wherever you are and whatever you're trying to do, you simply have to use your own imagination and learn the appropriate technology for what your imagination says to you, you should try to learn and develop. Because no other person can really tell a person where or what direction they should go with their work. I would say inquire and be knowledgeable and interested in seeing things, and from everywhere, you know. If you're in Ireland, they have smithing traditions. No, they're not African traditions, but look, iron is iron, heat is heat, and hammers are hammers, and they can be manual or electric. There can be electric saws or files, or there can be, you know, in other words, the tools, and the main tool, which is your imagination and personal commitment to trying to do something, trying to see what you will come up with, what you will invent yourself. The Nigerian creative person I'm most close to is Demas Nwoko, who's from the village Idumuje Boko, but he's done many important things. Google him up, and you will find you have a most profound person for the 20th and 21st century in terms of art and society. As far as, you know, you're alive, a younger man has the possibility of finding things my generation won't have that opportunity, you know. And you just, I'll be frank with you, the question you're asking me is really your job, not mine. Because I started this job over 60 years ago, and there's enough documentation on it, you know, by Googling and books and this and that. But on the other hand, I'll say this, I'm confident you and your generation will do well, you know, that you'll find your way, you know. And I'm just happy for myself that I've gotten to know artists on every continent on the world. And everybody's has done something, is doing something, and will do something. Now, whether they make the pages of this or that art magazine or this or that art book or that kind of thing, that's almost immaterial. I don't mean that I'm discounting the media, but I mean the main thing is, okay, do the work and you will make the discovery. Try to discover and you will make the work. They go together. And the combination will create a positive future for you and your work, you know. And I'm sorry, I don't know the Igbo words for just keep up the good work, but you come from a very broad, dynamic culture already, and you've lived internationally, so you've had a view of the world. Well, that's the same as me coming from the Gulf Coast of Texas, the piney woods of Texas, and sitting and drinking palm wine in Ibadan, you know, or if you're from Lagos, you know. Well, anyway, you know what I'm talking about, but I don't know if you ever read the writer J.P. Clark or Chinua Achebe. I just assume that you have.
I've read Chinua, but never J.P. Clark.
Well, I knew both of them. There's a picture of me and J.P. in a book, and his widow has a sculpture of mine for them. And Chinua was given one of my small sculptures at an award years ago in New York at City College, and I got to know him. And I mean, they're a part of my generation, or just a little senior to me, but the creative struggle. There was Ben Osawe, who was a carver, a sculptor from Benin, and what is it, Ben Nwonwu, any number of Nigerian sculptors and painters who, as I first encountered Nigeria in the 1970s, who then you're now living with their contributions, as the next generation will live with your contribution.
Thank you so much. Could I just finally ask you to spell the
Demas? We're going to have to shut it there. I'm sorry. I've just got a notice that we're running short on time. So thank you, Chinanam,
No
for that
problem.
question. Really nicely done. And do forgive me for interjecting. Mel, let me just say to you, endless thanks. You are an honorary citizen to many cities, a citizen of many nations, and a poet to the world. You are just a blessed human being, and we are so grateful to you that you share some of your time and shed some of your light today. I feel much warmer now than I did when we started. I will give you a call tomorrow to thank you more profusely, but for now, I see from our host that we have to wrap up. We've run over time here. Blessings upon all of us. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Bye-bye.